So why have you got a lawyer here? Well, we've been hearing a lot about the benefits of BIM. Lawyer's job is to ruin the party slightly. I'm going to describe a bit more about the burning platform. What are the risks of not adopting information models in your business? In Dame Judith Hackitt's interim report at the end of 2017, she described the current regulatory framework for buildings as not fit for the purpose. In her final report issued in May 2018, she went further and she described what she called the deep flaws within the current system. And I've set the general broad themes of these out here. Now, they're all really serious, and you could describe them as all interconnected and equally important. But for the purposes of today's talk on the golden thread, I'm going to focus just almost on these three: change, control, record keeping, and product process. Now, the interesting observation you can make about the current regulatory framework is that actually, look at this very simplified diagram of multi-occupancy residential regulatory framework, very, very, very simplified. But depending on where you are in the process, actually there is quite a prescriptive input-driven approach. And you're going to be dealing with a different bunch of regulations and a different bunch of regulators, depending on whether you're in the sort of design, delivery, or the occupation and maintenance phase. But what Hackitt concludes is that this input-driven approach isn't cutting it. And in fact, she goes further and she says that actually this approach prevents people who work on buildings and do building work from actually taking responsibility for what they're doing on those buildings. And the Hackitt report concludes that what might be a more effective approach would be a more output-based framework, which actually relies on the competency of the supply chains working on these buildings to do the right thing. Now, that's really important because that is a fundamental change from where we are today. So what does this all mean for us? Well, little diagram there on the kind of new framework that Hackitt report is recommending. I think for our purposes today, I'm going to focus just on two things. And the first one is this call for taking a more systems-based approach to building, i.e., don't just think about a component as a component. Think about a component as an integrated part of the holistic fire safety system of the building. The other thing I'm going to focus on is the transparency of the information and the audit trail. And this is, I know I'm preaching to a room full of the converted here, this is the golden thread to which Hackitt refers, this information that goes across the life cycle of the building, from planning through to construction, through to occupation and maintenance. And I can see some of you might think, well, this only applies to high-rise residential buildings. It doesn't apply to my organisation. Maybe we don't work on this kind of asset. Well, actually, I'd say think again, because in all likelihood, this is going to apply much more widely to all complex buildings and who knows what else in the future. But some of you might still be thinking, well, the regulations haven't come into force yet. Government's really, really focused on Brexit. Why do I need to care about this today? I think the answer to that is where we are in the cycle post the terrible tragedy at Grenfell is actually, we're in a very, very early stage. And the industry that we all work in, including myself, we haven't really experienced the full impact of this triple whammy of reputational, contractual, and regulatory risks, which have arisen as a result of this exposure to the systematic problems, what Hackitt calls the deep flaws in the system, that the tragedy at Grenfell has basically exposed and laid bare. And some of you might be starting to get a sense of this because it may be, if you think back, and maybe I've got the wrong people in the organisations here, that the last time you had to speak to your underwriters about your PI insurance, you noticed there was a lot more detailed questions around which portfolios in your which assets in your portfolio, which buildings that you've worked on contain this particular cladding risk. And you may or may not have been able to get those insured depending on how well you can answer that question. This is a sign of where we are in the cycle. What will the questions be next time round? Well, they might be longer again. Depending on where you are in the ecosystem, you'll be looking at these risks manifesting in different places. If I'm the owner of an asset like Jack, who's going to be on the panel later, I'll be really worried primarily about the welfare and health of my tenants and of my residents, and I'll probably be focusing really, really carefully on the regulatory risks and making sure that everything in the buildings that I'm responsible for complies. If I'm a contractor, which I know a lot of people in this room probably are, I'm going to be looking really carefully at where my contractual risk exposure might sit and kind of wondering, what I need to worry about next. But wherever you are, this risk isn't going away. And if we see a world where actually we take those insurance questions further and your insurer asks you in 1 year, 2 years, 3 years' time, actually, can you tell me, as part of the disclosure on the renewal of your insurance, can you tell me more about all of the products and materials and those assets that you've handed over that you're still in the defects period for or something else? Will you be able to answer that today? And what would you need to do in order to be able to answer that when that question comes along? So finally, I know we've got a lot of supply chain in the room, so I've been told, so I'm just going to spend a little bit of time focusing on where contractual claims in association with the condition, with products and materials might manifest, if you like, within your various businesses. If you're a construction contractor, you might be worrying primarily about defects and rectification claims. If you're somebody who's in the world of PFI and PPP operation, there's a lot of those still going on, by the way. Don't listen to the press. You might be worried about service failures, about the enormous financial consequences of having buildings deemed unavailable or parts of buildings deemed unavailable. Or you may be worried about handing that asset back. What condition is the asset in, and what condition have you agreed to hand it back in? Now, would having a golden thread of information in relation to the assets that you work on help you to predict, manage, and mitigate these risks? I think we all know the answer to that. The answer is probably yes, it would. So if you're going to take, the insurance thing I think has the power to be a real game changer, actually. Because if insurers do, and I can foresee a world where this disclosure thing gets more and more detailed as this technology becomes much more accessible, cheaper, easier to access. If those questions on disclosure get more and more detailed, that's really going to drive it, because otherwise you're going to end up with a whole lot of uninsured risks on your books, which no one's going to want to manage. But I mean, if I'm to leave you to take one thought away for your respective organisations, it would be this. Maintaining the status quo of poor records and poor information on your assets is actually risky, and it's only getting riskier. And I would say that with or without the new regulation that's likely to come post-Hackitt report, but then think about the impact of the regulation that is probably going to come post-Hackitt report, it may actually become illegal in relation to certain complex buildings. So sobering thoughts, but I'll leave it there.